Mr.
Senor.
Buenas tardes, or colloquially in Australian, g'day. Muchas gracias for the opportunity to speak on the topic of social protection and rights portability. I will briefly summarise the concept of social protection and social rights portability, issues around migrant workers' access to social security and multilateral agreements, and barriers to a common legislative framework. The portability of social protection benefits and rights refers to the ability of workers to keep or transfer their social protection rights from either one scheme to another, or for migrant workers from one country to another. In countries where the social protection system of retirement, disability and unemployment benefits is based on contributions from workers, often referred to as social insurance systems, portability allows for an individual to preserve or transfer their accrued benefits when they move to another country. For countries like Australia, where social protection systems are primarily based around residency and means, portability generally refers to the ability of benefit recipients to continue to receive their payments whilst absent overseas, but can also be used in the context of entitlements being recognised in another country, or Australia recognising migrants' social protection rights, usually under bilateral agreements. Rising labour mobility, particularly between developing and developed countries, as well as between developing countries, has seen portability become a key concern for policymakers. At issue is how portability, or the lack of it, influences migration decisions, the role social protection systems play in key life decisions, and migrants' rights to social protections as set out in international conventions and national legislation. Also at issue is the breadth of the definition of social protection, whether it covers conventional social welfare programs, particularly social security, or whether the concept should encompass an array of social services, including rights to education and healthcare, as well as labour protections and access to other support services, such as informal networks. This extended definition is captured by the agenda item's use of the term social rights. While in theory, migrant workers have certain rights protected by international legal instruments covering a broad range of issues, as most countries, including Australia, have not ratified these conventions, much depends on the protections offered by national legislation. Migrant workers in the Asia-Pacific generally have a low social and legal status in their host countries, particularly those with temporary work contracts and those who either enter illegally or who enter on one visa type and remain in the country as irregular migrant workers. Access to social security poses a particular difficulty for migrants, as most countries' social security systems determine eligibility based on periods of employment or residency. Most countries also make strict distinctions between the rights of permanent residents and citizens and those of temporary migrants or illegally resident migrants. Visa categories, work, study, family reunion or asylum and nationally are also often used to limit social security access. Available estimates suggest that around 78% of global migrants have some access to the social protection system in their host country. The level of the social protection offered, however, varies greatly between different countries. While migrant workers' access to social security and social protection more broadly is limited, access to portable benefits is much more restricted. Around 3/4 of global migrants, including undocumented migrants, are estimated not to be covered by an applicable social security agreement. The agenda item proposes a common legislative framework for social protection and social rights portability. Such a framework could take the form of either principles for portability enshrined in national legislation or possibly a multilateral social security agreement on the portability of benefits. Any agreement or framework would need to be aimed at reducing or eliminating barriers that prevent migrant workers obtaining social security entitlements. The key barrier to a common approach to social security portability in the Asia Pacific is the diversity of our social security systems and the differing coverage offered by each system. Harmonising all the component parts into a common framework or agreement and determining an acceptable way of balancing the financial cost of such a scheme would be very difficult. The Australian and New Zealand model of social protection, universal, flat rate payments with eligibility determined by residency and subject to means, is very different from the social insurance and provident fund systems prevalent in other countries. Australians' negotiations for bilateral agreements have been long and complicated, reflected in the fact that Australia currently has only 29 agreements in place, and have been aimed at sharing costs for social protection rather than ensuring rights are met. The Australian social protection system places significant barriers on access by migrant workers, particularly temporary visa holders. And Australia would resist moves to reduce these barriers, given the financial cost and the fact that such moves would run counter to the aims of our social security system and the migration program. Australia, therefore, has adopted a position of encouraging the continued development of inclusive social protection policies and systems in APPF countries while pursuing bilateral agreements rather than multilateral agreements. While Australia is unlikely to pursue a common legislative framework on portability of social protection and social rights, the development of comprehensive social protection systems in other countries would provide a better foundation for bilateral agreements. My friends, Australia has proposed a draft resolution on this topic and I commend it to the meeting. Muchas gracias, Mr. Chair.
Muchas gracias, Australia. Tiene la palabra Canadá. Michael Wallace se prepara.